So, a long time ago when I started teaching, this is 35 years ago, and I was teaching my first course on First Nations issues, and I got to teaching the Indian Act, and I couldn't work out how, I'm not a lawyer, I don't know anything about this stuff, I couldn't work out how to teach the Indian Act to a bunch of first-year students. And so I thought, well, the only way to teach it is sort of go through it section by section and explain to them each section. And so I would start off, it was very boring, ultra boring. Start off, working my way through it section by section. And usually after about 10 or 15 minutes, one of the students would go up their hand and say, "You're reading, the historical act from the 19th century, aren't you?" I said, "No, I'm reading the current one." And then somebody would go, "But that can't be true. Canada can't possibly have an act like that." And I'd say, "Well, I'm reading the current act. That's what we're doing here." And then my classes would just blow up. So ever since then, I've taught the Indian Act the most boring way possible, because you let the class blow up, and because most people just can't believe what's in here. Go ahead. Oh, I love that bit.
Yeah,
You did that one.
I messed up where I was. Anyway, the other thing that the Indian Act could do was that it could limit the size of the reserve, and so majority of it could be expropriated if possible, or part of it could be expropriated for if the government needed it to build a railway or something important like that, roads, those kinds of things. And the other way that it could be appropriated is if the land was not being used for cultivation. So take Roseau River, for example. Their territory actually extended west of the Red River. And if you go down Highway 75, some of that land was theirs, was their traditional territory, and that was part of their treaty. So a lot of that started to get expropriated. And because they weren't cultivating it and they weren't using it, well, how could they cultivate and use it when they were told that they couldn't sell their produce from the land? And so eventually, settlers started to lease the land until eventually, all of a sudden, it wasn't part of their reserve. And then it started becoming land that was owned. And so that's the other way that land got expropriated and taken away. So this is the introduction into residential schools as well. The Indian Act made it possible for the residential schools to happen, and we're going to be talking about that at some other time, so I won't get into that. But listen to this. This is Sir John A. Macdonald in 1879. When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents who are savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training mode and thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strongly impressed upon myself as head of the department, and Chris will probably talk about this, part of who was impressing themselves on John A. Macdonald is the Anglican Church of Canada, who had simply wrote a letter saying, hey, these kids, right, are learning from their savage parents. You need to start thinking about putting them and taking them away and putting them into an institution. So it has been strongly impressed upon myself as head of the department that Indian children should be withdrawn, which is what the church said, as much as possible from the parental influence, and the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools where they will acquire the habits and modes of thoughts of white men. And then that'll take us into residential schools next week. And there's more to the Indian Act, but these are more of the major points. But you can read the Indian Act online.
A question about who would have been the church leaders who who won? The bishops, the
Missionary Society.
Missionary Society, putting pressure on the politicians of Ottawa?
Yeah.
All of the above.
All of the above.
Yeah. And the other complication that gets in here, which we're about to get into, of course, is the competition between the Roman Catholics and the Protestants. There was no way the Protestants were going to let the Catholics get the upper hand, and there was no way the Catholics were going to let the Protestants get the upper hand. And so both of them were putting pressure onto the federal government.
And Methodist.
Well, they were the Protestants.
The Anglicans didn't like the Methodist.
Well, you still don't.
And then I gather in the reading you're going to do for this week, don't you hear the red man calling? Then some of the church leaders 30 years later realized the disaster that had been created by residential schools.
Well, okay, no, leave that up because I can read it over your shoulder. The second reading, which we want to go on to now, which is that if you get red man calling, it's Vince chose that reading, which is an interesting choice. For those of you who don't know, Samuel Blake was a very, 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 very prominent Anglican layperson in the late 1880s through to about 1910, 1915. He was actually nicknamed the Archbishop, which gives you some kind of indication of his influence. He is one of the founders of Wycliffe College in Toronto. He is also the financier behind St. Paul's Bloor Street in Toronto. He also founded Ridley College in St. Catharines. So he was also extremely wealthy and extremely influential. One of the things I read about today, which has nothing to do with this topic, but I think it's immensely funny, at Ridley College, he had an award for the boy who demonstrated the finest form of manliness. I don't know what that is. And apparently he withdrew the award when the principal of Ridley College got an honorary doctorate from Trinity College. So, church politics being what they are, is absolutely wonderful.
He was also the head of the Indian work
Commission.
of the Anglican Church.
Yeah. So the two things have happened running up to that particular report. One thing which you may not be aware of is that in 1905, the Church Missionary Society in particular, but most of the other missionary societies too, transferred their work from England to Canada. So they transferred the missions to the Canadian Church. And so all of a sudden, the Canadian Church becomes responsible and has to pay for all of these missions, which up to that point had been paid for by the Church Missionary Society. So it's a huge, huge thought on the Canadian Church's budget and suddenly have to start paying for all these missions. Now, what the Canadian Church actually does is it goes and dredges up a whole bunch of other missionary societies for them to contribute. Part of the problem was that the Church Missionary Society was getting too liberal, so we won't go down that road. So that's one of the pieces that you see in there, and they established what they're referring to as the MSCC, the Missionary Society of the Church of England and Canada, okay, which becomes the core operations for the Indian work, for the Indian Commission. All right, MSCC is the funding agency. Part of it is the Indian Commission of the Anglican Church. By the way, the MSCC still exists. It's now a shell company, but it does still exist. Okay, so I don't know that there's actually any money associated with it anymore, but there used to be.
Chris, so is the MSCC Canadian?
Yes, it's Canadian. It's the Missionary Society of the Church of England
in Canada.
In Canada. Yeah. Remember, we don't become the Anglican Church until the 1970s. So, so that has happened. The other thing that has happened, and which is right in front of me here on Vince's computer, is in 1907, Dr. Peter Bryce, produces a report on the residential schools. It's a very famous report because it is absolutely condemns the federal government and the churches for the operations of the schools and basically says that they are unsanitary death traps from a medical point of view. He actually provides a lot of the figures in terms of the statistics around the number of students that were dying in these schools and the rate at which they were dying. And so this is in 1907. One of the things I always say about residential schools is that despite what a lot of us think nowadays, there was no secret about what was going on in these schools. There were public reports. It's whether you choose to do anything about it or pay any attention to those reports. And so that pamphlet that you got is Blake's response from the Anglican Church basically to the Bryce Report. Okay? And Blake was famous, Blake was famous for his pamphleteering, by the way. He tended to write pamphlets on all kinds of subjects, and he was quite good at it. In fact, he employed, I think, 3 secretaries or something like that to crank out these pamphlets that he would then publish and distribute widely. Not all of them had to do with the Anglican Church, but that one did. And so as the head of the Missionary Society, he is writing a pamphlet in response to the Bryce Report. And I think it's a really interesting document to read, especially in relationship to the Indian Act, because it speaks to, and this is what I want us to talk about, it speaks to the very conflicted relationship between the church and the government. Now, I don't particularly want to get into the residential school part of it, although that's a core part of the argument at the moment, but to think about what's going on in that report in terms of the relationship between the church and the government, okay? Because it's a public pamphlet, but much of it is, directed at the government and it's directed at the church. So let's spend a second here and think about, should I ask how many people actually read it? Oh, by the way, I have to apologize for the coffee, but that's what happens when you work off of articles that have been photographed off of original documents and then put online. The coffee ends up being pretty crappy. So I apologize for that. I know you go nearly blind trying to read it, but welcome to the world of working in the archives, going blind reading documents. So that's part of it. So first of all, what sources is Blake using?
He uses letters and reports.
Hmm?
He uses letters and reports.
He's using letters and reports. Who are the letters and reports from? Bishops?
Right.
Well, this is actually answering Paul's question earlier. Bishops and missionaries on the ground. Some of whom he clearly likes, and some of whom he clearly doesn't like. So he has access to a fairly large network of reports that are coming into the office. Which ones does he tend to like?
Well, you agreed with Bryce.
Well, he agrees with Bryce. Yeah, he is using Bryce's report. But who else is he agreeing with?
Who's that one? That was, he doesn't really identify, just some person in whatever area that seems to know a lot about things, and he has some just very clear ideas about what exactly should happen.
It's actually Hines.
Okay. Oh, okay. And so the ideas fit with his ideas for how schools should be set up. He's got a very specific idea. And so
Hines had been the missionary in, I'm going to say it wrong, in northern Saskatchewan for many, many years. And that's what he's picking up on, and that's what I wanted you to, and thank you, Sheila. What he's picking up on is the missionaries who've been on the ground for a very long time. Okay? He's less enthralled with bishops who may or may not have quite the on the ground contact. It depends on where they are. Okay? What is Hines after? Or you said he lays it out very clearly. What does he think is the solution?
I'm not remembering now whether it was him or Blake's solution, but the
Well,
idea
he's
of
getting involved.
consolidating residential schools, not having individual schools on individual reserves, and dropping the industrial schools because they're not working.
What a surprise. Sorry,
And
yes.
perhaps, yes, not having small ill children coming to industrial schools.
Okay, so there are two issues there, but let's deal with that first one. And this is one of the issues on the ground. Yes, they want to consolidate the schools. They've got all these little schools all over the place, which, as he's arguing, are financially inefficient, and he wants to bring them together into larger operations. Okay. Now, where are all those little schools coming from? See, this is where the rubber hits the road for the church. Those are all the Anglican mission schools.
Yes.
Those are the schools that the missionaries have been establishing as they're working in local communities. I don't know if I've said this to you before. Remember, sorry guys, remember we're Protestants, okay? And Protestants have this very strange idea that people should be able to read the Bible in their own language, okay? So we've got to do two things. We've got to teach people to read and write, and then you've got to translate the Bible into their own languages so they can read it in their own languages. So the Protestants are, and I'm being somewhat cynical here, but it's true. The Protestants are extremely keen on people learning to read and write, and the reason they want them to read and write is because they want them to be able to read the Bible on their own. All right? That sort of eludes us sometimes these days.
Local schools are not residential
No,
schools.
these are local schools that they're dealing with. And most of them are founded by the missionaries
Yeah.
to teach the local people to read and write in their own language so that they can read the Bible. We won't get into problems of translation of the Bible, but there are huge problems on that.
And they're day schools, right?
They're usually some form, they're not even really regular schools in a lot of ways. They often run on a fairly irregular basis whenever the missionary, and actually to be honest, more often the missionary's wife is around. So they're often quite irregular as far as that goes. But they're all over the place, these little schools. And they're going to have very few students, and they're going to be operating often in indigenous languages. Okay?
Now, one of the things that keeps coming up in this report too, though, is that it's not resulting in a lot of converts.
No.
Yeah.
Well, okay. That's going to be one of our little struggles as we go along, because of course, what does it mean when you say converts? All right. When you get to the article that I wrote, which we will hit at the end of the course, I argue that one of the biggest problems for the Anglican Church is that we still have problems actually believing that First Nations people have actually become Christians. So, you know, it's pretty doubtful this guy sitting beside me is actually a Christian. How could he be? He's got all these other strange ideas, right?
And he's not a person.
Well, he is now because it's like wearing blazers and, wearing a check shirt with blazers, for God's sake. But
It's not the done thing.
But I think something you have to be careful on as they go along. I know Blake is not saying that they're not converts. I would suggest to you that something else might be going on the ground, and this is one of my favorite sayings actually comes from Archbishop Tutu. Archbishop Tutu once said that when the white people arrived in South Africa, they had the book and the blacks in South Africa had the land. And now the whites have all the land and the blacks have the book, but it's a very dangerous book. Okay, and one of the problems, if I can put it this way, with the Protestant position of insisting that people can read the Bible on their own, is that people can and do read it on their own. And sorry guys, it's a pretty revolutionary book, right? And people are actually getting ideas out of this. They may not be the ideas that we in the West want them to get, right? In fact, they don't get the ideas we want them to get. They get other crazy ideas like love and equality and dying for other people and justice and all this sort of stuff, rather than understanding the hierarchy of lay people, deacon, priest, bishop, they should understand.
Well, part of this problem too could be explained by what was going on, in that at that time, to be a Christian meant that you be civilized, right? Therefore, living in a community of some sort, city or village. But the other thing is that you were sedentary and you were making a wage. Right? And you were going to church consistently. And Native people weren't doing any of this. And so, because they weren't civilized according to the definition at that time, some of them would not be considered Christians. And therefore, needed more lassoing, maybe the right word?
Tightening of the noose, I would
Yes.
say, but
That's right.
the fact that people are actually maybe were reading the Bible on their own and praying on their own, and they were gathering, and this is my experience in the Arctic, and I think Brian can speak to it too, that people would gather in their own houses and read the Bible, well, the New Testament there, but that's what they had, but read the New Testament, and actually the senior men in the household, I recognize the patriarchy of what I just said, but the senior men in the household would lead daily prayers. But they're not gathering in the community, they're not doing all this other stuff that we think they should be doing. So, whether or not they're converted or not, as Vince said, they're not converted on a certain definition of conversion, right? And so I think that you need to be really careful on that. These folks are reading they're reading whatever scriptures are available. They're reading versions of the prayer book, if they're Anglican. And I say versions because nobody has ever done any research into what actually is in some of those prayer books. Everybody assumes that it's all the Book of Common Prayer. It's actually not, if you actually read them. But we won't get into that particular little saw. That's one of my little axes to grind. So, and also, by the way, we don't also know what a lot of those translations are, because the translations could sometimes go a little sideways. Okay, I'll tell you a story. My only contribution to Anglican liturgy and Anglican missions was in the Inuktitut. The word for wife is nuliak. In the nominal form. In the verbal form, nuliak is to have sexual intercourse. And in the dialect that I speak, that's what animals do. Humans, kuyak folk, animals, nuliak folk. And there is a part in the marriage service where it says, "Will you, Vincent, take Christine to be your lawful wedded wife?" And in Inuktitut, it said, "Nuliak liyuk," which actually means, "Will you have sex with her like an animal?" So a little bit of a problem in the translation there. And I was asked by the Diocese of the Arctic to see if I could sort this little translation. I did. But it couldn't work out why the Inuit seemed to think that the marriage service was so hysterical. So we won't get into translation issues, all right? But the important thing to get back to our point, and Blake, is that you've got these small little schools all over the place that, from a missionary society point of view, okay, the Canadian Church funding this operation, are highly inefficient. You've only got small numbers of pupils out there, spread out in all these schools. You've got to pull them together into more centralized schools. So that's point one. Point two, which you made over here, I think did you make it, Dale? The point about the children that were being admitted to the schools. And this is a huge issue, and remains a huge issue up until the schools were closed in 1990. The last ones were closed in 1996. The federal government paid on a per capita basis. So in order for you to financially operate your school, you had to have enough heads to make enough money to be able to operate it, okay? And what do? Basically, you admit anybody who can stand up. And he's saying they're 4, 5, and 6. What the heck are we doing admitting 4, 5, and 6-year-olds into the school? They're sick. They're full of tuberculosis and other things. They also, by the way, that part doesn't discuss it, but they also would admit Métis into the schools and kind of pretend that they were First Nations. And actually, at some point, they would actually admit dirt poor white people and simply not admit. My good friend and colleague Peter Kuczynski, who teaches in the Native Studies department here, went to residential school because he came from dirt poor white, and they didn't know what to do with him, so they sent him to a residential school. Actually, it's kind of funny, I have to tell you, when he was teaching, what he does teach here still, but when he taught here at the University of Manitoba, half the kids that he went to school with were now in his classes, and they used to beat him up when he was little, because he was a skinny little guy. They used to beat him up when he was a kid. And then all of a sudden, he's the professor in their classes, so it created some really interesting dynamics in our department. But, so they would basically take anybody they could get to fill those schools. And because they were on a per capita basis, they would also try and crowd them, as crowded as they could possibly fit in the beds, and he's talking about that as well. So those are the dynamics that he's getting. He's getting that information from the Bryce report, but also from the missionaries on the ground. Okay? So who's he fighting with? Who's his fight with?
Well, he alludes to, a report from some people he doesn't like very much, but we don't really see.
Yeah, I don't know which one that is.
Said.
Yeah, my guess is that it's a report that's come into the MSCC.
Yeah.
Probably from one of the dioceses. My guess would be, my guess is probably one of the high church dioceses.
Yeah.
But
Well, there is some east-west stuff going on.
yeah, there's a lot of east-west
Yeah.
stuff.
Because a whole lot of the money is coming from the east.
All the money's coming.
And the problem is, those are the people furthest away from the ground.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was saying during the lunch, the break, by the way, one of the things that, again, we don't see, and nobody has done any research on, if anybody's looking for PhD thesis, is things like the Anglican Church women. Back in the 20s, all these ladies groups are meeting all across Canada. Every time you met, you'd put your nickel or your penny into the pot. But if you take all of those nickels and pennies for all the ladies across Canada and pool them into the MSCC, which is what happened, it's quite a pile of money. And nobody has ever accounted for that. Nobody's ever accounted for that
In
money.
1902, they had the opportunity to become their own. I actually did my MDiv thesis up to 1902. And they had the opportunity to become the Women's Missionary Society of the Church of England in Canada and chose to remain an auxiliary because that's when the MSCC became its own.
Came into being.
Yeah.
So it's a really interesting dynamic if you think about it, and it's one that's completely hidden to us. All right. He's railing against a report, but who else is he writing to? And he quotes his own letter at some length. I thought that was really cheeky. Right, he quotes the entire letter.
Yeah.
Who's he writing to?
Frank Oliver.
Who's Frank Oliver?
Superintendent General of Indian Affairs, Ottawa.
Oh my goodness, the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs, Ottawa.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, the person in charge of all Indians in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
So this would have been an elected MP that was appointed to do this?
He's probably I'm sorry, Frank Oliver would have been the elected MP. Most of the work goes to the deputy minister, who's actually the other guy, Pendley or whatever his name is. At the time, Indian Affairs is part of the Department of Interior, and it's part of the Mines Division. Mines Division in the Department of Interior. And the Department of Interior was usually actually the Prime Minister's prerogative, but not by this time. It's gone Frank Oliver. So he's writing directly to the Superintendent General. So he's writing to the minister in Ottawa. Okay. And he's not only that, he's getting responses. So we're talking about an ability to influence and speak directly to the people who are in charge and who are administering the Indian Act. So the senior person of the Missionary Society in Canada is in direct personal contact with the minister in charge of India. Okay. By the way, there's no Indians in any of this discussion.
No.
That's right. You wouldn't want to involve the First Nations people in trying to make any decisions about the stuff. Okay. So that's another thing you have to be aware of in this correspondence. So he is able to directly access and talk to the minister in charge of Indians. Also, you should be aware that the Indian Affairs Department at that time consisted of about 12 people. So he says that there are about 41,000 First Nations at the time, the numbers he's giving. There are about 12 people administering these 41,000 people. And of those 12 people, most of them were clerks and actually box packers. Okay? There were only 2 people who actually had administrative charge. Who was one of them? He was in your notes before it shut down. Well, Duncan Campbell Scott.
So how many Native people are we dealing with here? 41,000?
About 41,000 at the
That's
time.
it?
Well, there are more, but that's the ones that are registered at the time.
Oh, okay.
My guess is actually those are the Protestant Indians.
Right.
Yeah, we're counting the Protestants. If you're Catholic, you're beyond the pale. Okay?
Does that include the Western First Nations?
At this time, yes. By this time, it does. Okay. So what's the relationship between the Anglican Church and the governing powers at the time?
Cozy.
Well, more than friendly. Just remember that Slate's brother, Edward, was Premier of Ontario. Okay? They're the same people. They're all the same people. The Anglican Church is deeply embedded in the government processes.
The Tory Church at prayer? Tory Party at prayer? Is the Anglican Church of Canada?
We might have been, yes. Yeah. I don't know how much of prayer we were, certainly not in this particular instance, but yeah, it is. So, and what you're seeing in here is the attempt by the church to have a direct impact on Indian policy. Okay? Now, in this particular case, how do we put this nicely? We didn't do very well in the fight. Okay? Now, we did do well in the fight that Sheila pointed us to, the consolidation fight. We did very well in that one. We didn't do very well on the money fight, because the government didn't change the per capita grant. The other thing that he refers to a number of times in there, and you're probably not aware of this, is he keeps referring to quite elaborate schools that are being built, and yet there are no students for them. Okay? And this is, again, one of the really interesting tensions between the churches and the government. Because the churches would build the schools, right? And usually the missionaries would arrange to build the schools. They would raise the money and they'd build the schools. And having built the schools, they then expected the government to pay for them. And the government was starting to say, no, if you build a school, you pay for it. The church would say, no, there are Indian schools, therefore you have to pay for it. And this is why you're getting this conflict. You're also getting the conflict because, of course, the Anglican Church, and because of the Methodists and the Presbyterians at this point. So the Protestant churches are building schools to try and block the Catholics, all right, to try and outflank the Catholics. But it's not working, and so the Protestant schools are ending up empty next door to a full Catholic school. You don't see that in this article, that's what's going on. Okay? So there's a real tension between the church and the government. So about who has the right to build the school. The missionaries and the missionary societies are very keen on building schools. The government is less keen on them building schools. That means that every time they build one, they've got to run another school. Okay? So there's this enormous tension between the two. But at the same time, it's enormous agreement that this is what we should be doing. Okay? As you know, Vince was pointing out, to be a real Christian, you have to read, write, do arithmetic, you have to be able to farm, you have to be dressed in a jacket and slacks, and cut your hair, you have to bath at least once a week. You know, huh?
Just once a week.
Well, actually, most of these schools, those of the people from England will tell you that it's very bad for you to bath more than once a month because you get humors and die. So, I always remember a friend of mine who went to Gordonstoun School, which is a very famous school in Scotland. He was a prof here at St. John's. This is where Prince Charles went. He said that he could never stand baths on Saturday night because there was one tub of cold water and 30 boys. And if you were number 30, it wasn't a pleasant experience. By the way, these are the kind of schools we're talking about. And that was a very famous and rich school in England. So, and that was also in the 1950s. So I want you to think very carefully and start making some notes to yourself about what is the relationship between the church and the state overall. Okay? Because it's different from the relationship now. So let's have some ideas of what you saw in that article in terms of the relationship between the church and the state. I mean, frankly, do you think that Bishop Don wrote a letter to the Minister of Indian Affairs today that he'd be lucky if he got a response? Well, you probably would, but one of those, dear sir, thank you for your letter.
But it is true. I mean, I remember some faculty up here, I think from the history department, saying that, 150 years ago, the signature of the Bishop of Rupert carried a great deal of weight.
Yes.
In a way that it does not now.
Yeah. Yeah. He does get mentioned in that Blake article.
I saw that.
Yes, a few times. Yeah.
There was, somewhere in a history class I took here once upon a time, there was a series of letters that had been written because a newspaper incorrectly referred to a Roman Catholic bishop as a Lord Bishop. And the newspaper exploded with outrage over the admission of a Roman Catholic to the House of Lords by the Winnipeg Free Press or something. So there was deep public concern over what the church was doing and how it was represented.
Well, and we do have to remember, and something that I often have to remind students in the era that we're talking about, the deep, deep hostility and rift between the Roman Church and the Protestant churches. I mean, never the twain should meet. And so this is a huge issue underlying what we're seeing in this article. It doesn't help, of course, it's like the evangelical family on top of it. And it's the ability, the interesting thing is, of course, the Roman Catholic Church's ability to influence the state is actually a good deal greater than the Anglican churches at the time. Is that mine? I don't know, it's probably my wife's that is. It is, okay. Sorry about that. There is that very direct connection. What about in terms of policy?
There's sort of an assumption that everyone's on the same page about the goal. The conversation is about tactics and how we're going to get there.
Yeah. And I think, by the way, this is something important to note about colonialism, is that the goal was generally agreed upon to civilize and assimilate the First Nations. But there was huge disagreement on how to achieve it, and there was huge conflicts. Now, one of the interesting things about that article is there's huge conflicts within the Anglican Church about how to achieve it. Okay? And
So
those.
different from nowadays.
Hmm?
So different from nowadays.
Well, no, it is true. The point is that the parties are divided amongst themselves on how to do this. Okay? So there's conflicts within the church, there's conflicts within the government about it. What other policy things in terms of that? So the goal, which is obviously assimilation, is agreed upon.
Well, something you mentioned back a week or two ago, like the expectation was that over time, Indians would die off. So what if the schools were unhealthy and kids are contracting TB and dying, and there isn't proper ventilation, and all the rest of it? There's not a lot of, it may not be stated policy or stated goal, but if that's still in the back of the minds of.
The vanishing Indian trope.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's still very much it's still a trope today, but it certainly is at that time.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't matter if these Indian kids are dying by the hundreds in the schools, because they're going to die anyway, so they may as well die now as later. Yeah. And that's an unfortunate way of putting it, but it's probably an agreed upon policy. By the way, you want to make sure they're Christians before they die, so they go to heaven. Okay.
So possibly the goal was assimilation, but the government and the church's path to it was different? Because the churches were civilized, Christianized,
yes.
and the government was like, yeah, that'd be nice, but...
The path was different. The other interesting thing about these schools is the problem of who's subsidizing who in these schools. The government, of course, because it's paying a fixed per capita fee for the churches to run the schools, feels that they're subsidizing the churches to run church schools. The churches feel that the government should be paying for the schools, and through their mission societies and their other efforts, they're subsidizing the government to run the schools. And so they basically can't agree on a funding formula to run these schools. And so the solution is basically not to have one, which means that they are chronically, and this is actually the point in John Malloy's book, International Crime, they're chronically underfunded. Never ever funded even remotely adequately. Brackets hasn't changed. Okay. First Nation schools are still funded at a rate about 2/3 of non-First Nation schools. Okay.
The authors seem to be saying in this that if you actually paid enough money to have really good teachers that actually educated the children in the schools, then the goals would be met.
We will never know, will we?
But that doesn't seem to have gotten anywhere.
Yeah. Who's teaching in these schools, by the way? And basically anybody they can get. But usually it's good Christian souls who are doing this because they think this is a proper thing to do. We'll encounter more of that next week.
One of the things that Duncan Campbell Scott said about that is that there were actually teachers who wrote to the federal government to say, this funding is inadequate. And there were some principals who wrote to the federal government as well. And one of the things that Duncan Campbell Scott said was that that's fine, keep them where they are, otherwise if they get way too educated, they'll rise against us.
So it's a multi-dimensional problem. But incidentally, the other problem that you run into, of course, is who's teaching in the Catholic schools. Nuns and priests. Do you have to pay that? The Protestants have to pay their teachers, the Catholics don't, which creates a huge problem in the system. Okay? And it's not until the teachers are unionized in 1953 that suddenly turns around.
So I have a friend who grew up in India and said that he went to a residential school and he basically lost his culture and his faith. But he got a damn good education and he's been up until recently teaching medicine here at UM. So why did they get a good education in India and not here?
Probably depends on which school you was at.
Yeah.
That would be the
There weren't
question.
any here. There weren't any residential schools here that you could say, depends on which school you went in.
Well,
That he would have gone on to Cambridge.
you have to be a little careful because you see in India you get the equivalent of schools like Upper Canada College and Ridley College, and the upper caste Indians could go to those schools.
That's right.
But they were paying for it.
And they would pay for it.
Okay.
Yeah. My guess is if you're going to the mission school in Hyderabad, run by the CMS missionaries, it probably wasn't a whole lot different than what you're getting here.
So the funding formula was the East Indians are paying for this.
The only reason I know that is my father's one of those too.
Yeah.
My father went to one of those schools. He wasn't Indian, he was English.
What about the priests in the Catholic schools? They should have been well educated, wouldn't they?
The
Priests in the Catholic schools would have been well educated, would they not?
Well,
The Jesuits probably?
well, they're not Jesuits, they're Oblates. They're all Oblates. Depends what you mean by well educated.
For the time.
Well, they could read and write. The theology that they were taught is that they all sat in nice neat rows, and the senior priest in the seminary would simply read out St. Thomas Aquinas to them. If that's a good education, at least you will have heard St. Thomas Aquinas in its fullness once. But that's how they were educated in those days. So be careful. Their education would be, in some ways, as limited. Not the Jesuits, but the Jesuits only operated one school. Okay, but their education would have been as limited as the Anglican clergy would have been in those days. And the Anglican clergy in those days all knew Greek and Hebrew and could work in Greek and Hebrew. So, which is actually one of the reasons why they could also learn the indigenous languages. So, it's a bit difficult to tell. The seminary education systems were not university type. In fact, that's one of the things that happens in the 19th century, is both in the Roman churches and in our church, the seminaries get separated off from the universities into separate bodies, and education then shifts for clergy in the 19th century. So you have to be a bit careful around that. How well educated they were is probably slightly more limited than we'd like to think of it. Okay.
I'm not trying to defend.
No, I'm just saying you have to be careful because education for both our clergy and for the Roman clergy. On the other hand, the Presbyterian clergy were highly educated. Okay, but with all due respect to the Anglican Church and the Roman Church, ours were not.
What about the Dominicans in Quebec?
But they're not offering that. They're not offering.
They're not doing that. No.
Only the Oblates are operating schools for First Nations children. Nobody else does it, except for the one Jesuit school.
And was it also the case that Indian residential schools only provided half the day of actual teaching?
It depends on where you were.
The other half was like for labor-intensive type. Yeah.
Yeah.
So right off the bat.
Also lent out.
Yeah, like right off the bat, the indigenous students would be losing half the day.
Yeah. Couple things about that. That's true in most of the schools. That changes over time. And that can be a big fight. But remember what I started off by saying. We're dealing with Protestant. From our point of view, we're dealing with Protestant schools where you want them to be able to read and write so they can read the Bible. That only takes half a day. No, I'm being cynical, but it is very limited what they're trying to achieve, okay? And so that's why but the main reason is that these schools are so poor, they were so underfunded, that they needed the labor of the children in the farms and in other things in order to be able to make them financially viable. And so you have basically running farms. Now, the theory is that they're teaching them how to farm.
Right. Under the guise.
Under the guise of free labor. But, yeah, all right, we teach them to farm, but we send them back to a reserve where if they farm and they actually do the work, they can't sell the produce.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So there's also here, John Hines is recommending that the government adopt a system of compulsory education. So in 1906, they would not.
In fact, the compulsory education amendments come in right about that time. So they do in fact take up that recommendation. They change the Indian Act to make it compulsory at that point. Okay. It's not, prior to that it's not. But the main reason it's not prior to that is because, you know, how do you enforce compulsory education in a place like Split Lake, Manitoba in 1906?
Yeah.
There's no way to do it. But as we get into this period, they can more and more enforce that. So, anyways, thank you. I thank you for that. Next week we actually do residential schools. And we having this fun. All right, so next week we'll actually directly tackle them. But I want you to use this to reflect on the relationship between the church and the state. Very, very different from that. We're in bed together with the Indian.
Google Cough is no better, right? I'm going to check the UW.